Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and this is the Dan Clark Audio Noire X Open. This is a full-size, open-back, planar magnetic headphone that lists for $1,300 US. This was sent to me on loan from Audio 46. Audio 46 has made no attempt to influence my opinion on this headphone, so all thoughts that you are about to hear are mine and mine alone. The link where you can buy this down in the description from Audio 46 will be an affiliate link though, so if you like what I have to say about this headphone and you want to buy it, you can support the channel by using that affiliate link. I will get a small kickback, and doing so just helps me keep the channel running and bringing you cool content like this. Alright, but this is a loan. It will be going back shortly. Now, Dan Clark headphones have quite a reputation for being really well tuned, and specifically tuned very close to the Harman target on there. I believe it's the Harman 2018 target that they used. This one deviates from that target in some key areas, and that surprised me. I have a few questions about some of the tuning choices and realities that were made with this headphone, and so this ends up being a headphone that is not for me. We will spend some time talking about whether or not it is for you right on the other side of shameless self-promotion.
Hi, it's me again, 14 months later and a whole foot taller. Now, since Wave Theory liked the first 10,000 subscriber play button I made him, maybe he wants a 25,000 subscriber play button. This can only happen if you subscribe though. Now, since over 60% of the watch time comes from unsubscribed viewers, I'm gonna need you to subscribe. You can also sign up for his Patreon or send him money in PayPal. Links in the description. Now, on to the video.
As usual, lots of ground to cover here, so this can get on the long side, get comfortable, and also use the timestamps to jump around and watch the parts that are of most relevance or interest to you. Alright, a little bit more context on this review here. This is, by my count, the 5th Dan Clark headphone that I will have published a review for, and it will be the 6th Dan Clark headphone that I have had meaningful listening time with on my own gear and here in my own home. So, the reviews that came before this would have included the high-end, top-of-the-line units from Dan Clark, and those would be the Expanse and the Stealth. I have also reviewed the Noire X, the closed version of this. I have reviewed, and I liked so much that I went out and bought from Audio 46 the E3, which is a $2,000 US closed back headphone, and was like my product of the year for 2024. Okay, I think very highly of this headphone right here. And then also I have acquired in a trade, but did not review the predecessor to the Noire XO here, and that would be the Aeon 2 Open here. And so, I've got some context about like what Dan Clark is all about, what his goals are, and that sort of thing. And like his ethos really seems to be all about the Harman target. He really works hard to get the tunings of his headphones to be very, very close to the Harman 2018 target. And more often than not, he succeeds. Now, the Aeon 2 probably does not hit the 2018 target, or may not have been that goal. I want to say this one was released in maybe 2019, right around that time, so I don't know if he was working to the 2018 target then or not, but getting a very neutral tuning and like research-based tuning out of his headphones has long been one of Dan's ethoses. Anyway, whatever the plural for ethos is, right? And he has by and large hit it. Now, what I said at the top of the video here is that this one, the Noire X Open, actually deviates from that target, both by ear and by measurement in some key areas that just do not work for me very well. And I also found it to be very, very amp sensitive, like the perception, the amount that it deviated from the Harman target really seemed to change moving from amp to amp, and it wasn't always predictable on what the amp would be based on like the overall quality of that amp or the price of that amp. It seemed rather unpredictable, other than a pattern did emerge, okay, as I listened here. So we're gonna talk about like matching to signal chains and that sort of thing here as the review unfolds. But for me, particularly in the mid-range on this Noire X Open headphone is too erratically tuned, where it sounds thin, unrealistic, a bit ragged, and very fatiguing for me from most amplifiers through the very important mid-range. And so it ends up not being for me. But there are some amps that it does chill out just a little bit. It does respond to EQ well for those of you who are into EQ. So I do think that this will still land with an audience out there. Are you in that audience? Let's talk more and find out here. All right, so this again is the Noire X Open, or the Noire XO. It is an open back planar magnetic headphone, and it is meant as the direct successor, at least according to Dan Clark's website, of this Aeon 2 Open here. And it not only is the direct successor to that, it pulls in some of the technology, some of the metamaterial and AMTS, okay, Dan's acoustic treatment system in there, or tuning system, I should say, in there that are used on the higher end models that started with like the Expanse and the Stealth and like are in the E3, and now they're trickling down to cheaper and cheaper models in here. So this one has that, and again lands at $1,300 US. The nominal impedance on this headphone is 15 ohms. Dan is a little bit cagey about publishing other specs, like what's the sensitivity on this headphone? I don't know. I do know that some of the measurement websites out there like ASR and headphones.com have put this headphone through some pretty extensive measurements, as they always do. I looked those over after I listened to this for a while, made sure I did some listening impressions first, then went and was like, there's some weird things going on here sonically. What do the measurements say? And then went and looked at those measurements to see like what was going on. And yeah, there was a fair amount of agreement with the problems I was hearing and the measurements I was seeing. Okay, but back to that impedance, that 15 ohms of impedance there again is not flat. Okay, there is some passive electrical filtering in here, which varies the impedance of the driver to help get to some of that like Harman tuning in there. Like specifically, if I remember correctly, the impedance is a little bit higher in the bass region, which draws a little bit more power from the amplifier, and then that also helps produce like more bass presence to get to that somewhat elevated bass shelf that the 2018 Harman Target has in there. All right, and so most planar magnetic headphones have a flat impedance from about 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. They have a nearly ruler flat impedance almost all the time. This one does not, and because it's already low in nominal impedance, you do want to use this on an amplifier that has a low output impedance on it. And the reason for that, I have a whole video that talks about like output impedance and damping factor and why that's important. I will link to that down in the description below here as well. But suffice it to say here that if you get an amplifier that has an output impedance that is kind of like between the impedance ranges that this headphone has, you can get some pretty funky behavior out of this headphone. Now, the vast majority of solid state amplifiers out there anymore do have an output impedance that is low enough that it's not going to be an issue. Where it really is going to be an issue more often than not is with tube amplifiers. So just be careful on there, particularly output transformerless tube amplifiers, or OTL. They have high output impedance. Now, there are some solid state amps that also have a high output impedance, so you have to be careful there. Just most of them, particularly late models, that have very, very low output impedance. The example that I have here that I ran into some issues with is I recently got a Shit Valhalla 3 in for review, which is an OTL, or output transformerless tube amplifier on it. It does have an impedance multiplier on it in there to help with low impedance planars like this one. Without the impedance multiplier engaged, I was getting some like bass distortion very audibly coming through here on this headphone and so forth. But I put that impedance multiplier on, engage it on the Valhalla 3, then I get a nice, clean, clear sound. So that's just one example of the kind of thing you have to look out for here. Now, this headphone is like moderately easy to drive then, or like It's not a super easy drive, but again, the impedance is such that it's fairly low. Even though it's not flat, it's still always pretty low. And then the sensitivity, I don't know what it is. It's not fantastic, but it's also not terrible. On my LTA Z10E amplifier, for example, which has a digital readout on its volume level, I had to get to perceived volume matching on this headphone. This had to be about 10 clicks louder than the Hi-Fi Man Aria Unveiled, for example, which is an easier driving planar as well, just to kind of help contextualize the difficulty of drive there. All right. But other than that, like, it's built like a Dan Clark. You've got this interesting pattern on the grill here. You've got this kind of like ear-shaped ear cup here. You've got these collapsible headband system. It comes in, come on, collapse, I say. Okay, and it fits into a nice carrying case, which looks exactly like what came with the Noire closed ahead of it, or the Noire X closed ahead of it, and is very similar to like the carrying case that comes with the E3. Okay, all that kind of stuff in there, and okay, it collapses right up. It still has the same cable entry that Dan Clarks have with these locking 4-pin connectors. The name is escaping me, but that's what it has. This one shipped with a 2-meter long, okay, 4.4 millimeter balance cable that's called the Dumber cable. I don't know why it has that name. It's just what it's called. It may have a meaning. I just don't know what it is. Okay. It's not a bad cable. Okay. It doesn't really tangle. It does loop up on itself a little bit, but it's very easy to straighten it out. It might be just a little bit stiff and springy for some, but as far as like included stock cables go, not the worst thing that I have used by far on there. Okay. But then like, classic Dan Clark fashion here, you have the suspension strap headband system with these 2 bars right up here, and then this automatically adjusting kind of elastic mechanism here on the headphone, or the head size adjustment. These ear pads have fairly large openings for large ears, and again, you can just kind of see they are ear shaped. They are very soft. Okay, in there, and they also are quite breathable. No hot ears or anything like that going on here. Okay, but as with Dan Clark's of past, like it kind of molds to your head when you put it on there. The clamp force is well balanced, holds on the head well. Okay, you can't really shake it out of place. It doesn't fall off your head when you look up or down. Okay, that sort of thing. But it also never feels tight. It's a very non-fatiguing wear. Now, typical with open Dan Clarks of the past, there is more attenuation to the sound than there are for typical open back headphones. Some of that I think is because of the AMTS tuning system in there, but just generally it's like not as open sounding as something like a Hi-Fi Man or the Audio-Technica open backs that are out there or anything like that. So it's not, there's stuff going on there. Now, everyone around you is still going to hear what you're listening to. You're not going to block out much in the way of ambient noise, but it still is not like as open sounding as those others that I mentioned there. Okay. So, typical Dan Clark, excellent build, excellent comfort. It looks the part, it feels the part. Okay, it's got the same kind of connectors on it. It collapses up well, fits into a small carrying case, etc., etc. Like all of the build and ergonomic stuff that is now associated with the Dan Clark brand is definitely here and is definitely well done. All right, now let's start transitioning to the sound and get into my issues with this, and then also help determine whether or not it is right for you. So I mentioned some amp sensitivity with this headphone here, and so it's in a fairly extensive list of test gear. So let's go through it here a little bit. On that, I'm a digital music listener, so all of the music files that I would have started with would have been lossless or high-res FLAC files or DSD files played locally, or in the case of FLAC files, streamed from Qobuz, all through a Roon system here in my house. Roon endpoints would have included FIO SR11, Sonor Ultra Rendu, and Chord 2Go plus 2Go Streamer plus 2U DDC when necessary, or just driving directly off of the Chord Hugo 2 DAC amp, again also fed by a 2Go streamer. The FIO SR11 is currently being routed through the Singer SU6 on my desktop. There are 3 DACs connected to that right now because I'm evaluating some. Those include the Live Micro DAC, the Topping Centaurus, which is in for review, and the Shit Bifrost 2/64. At times during this review cycle, the Shit Mimir DAC would have been in there as well. I did also use the Shit Mimir DAC connected to a direct USB to the FIO SR11 and then routed through a Shit Midgard amplifier. And then I also used the a FIO SR11 into the mesh DAC card of a Shit Asgard X, okay, which also came in for review, driving it off of the Asgard X and then RCA output from the preamp output of the Asgard X into that Shit Valhalla 3 amplifier that I already mentioned. Okay, on my desktop, those 3 DACs that I mentioned that are there right now are running through a Little Bear XLR switch and then into a Vioelectric HPA V281. Also on my desk right now is an all-in-one, the Luxon X9, which is a very popular unit right now and taught me some interesting things about this headphone. So that got some time on here as well. That is in turn also being fed by the Singer SU6 route from a FIO SR11. The Sonor Ultra Rendu is currently running through a Vice Engineering INT204 DDC, which then is in turn connected to a Berkeley Alpha Series 2. Another Sonor Ultra Rendu is direct USB into my Lampezator Baltic 3 DAC. Both of those DACs through a switcher go into an LTA Z10E amplifier. Okay, so that's a lot of different stuff in here. Let's start talking about what I have learned. Now, it is important to note here as we start turning our attention towards sound that the Dan Clark brand is well known to need some significant break-in time. Dan is very upfront about this and has stated publicly multiple times that his headphones ship needing break-in. I found that this headphone, it definitely needs some. Right out of the box, I got a brand new in-the-box unit. It was just a little bit harsh and crunchy sounding. That really evened out after about 50 hours. Now, I didn't listen for straight up 50 hours because ain't nobody got time for that when you're trying to review the volume of gear that I'm trying to review here. So I set up a little burn-in station and to just let this go overnight sessions for several nights running until I got past the 50-hour mark, just playing music there past the 50-hour mark, and I would come down every morning and put this on my head and just see what had changed. Once I hit roughly the 50-hour mark, somewhere in there, that kind of harshness and crunchiness to the sound definitely smoothed out, and I thought that it was time to do a fair evaluation. I did notice some tuning issues after that, so just to be sure that the tuning issues were not related to break-in, I gave this another 60 hours over about 4 or 5 nights of break-in time there, doing the same thing, just playing music overnight, all night long, coming down in the morning, putting it on my head, seeing if anything had changed. So add all of that up, and we were probably getting close to 115 to 120 hours of just break-in time, plus the significant number of hours I spent listening to this headphone on there in terms of use. So I do think we got well past the break-in thing, though I should say that around 50 hours for the unit that is on my head right now was the magic number. Okay, your mileage may vary a little bit on that one. Okay, that is less than other Dan Clarks. Like the Expanse and the Stealth, for example, took like a week. They took at least 100 hours in there to really feel like they settled out. Okay, this one is about half that. Okay, now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the sound here, and it changes from amp to amp. So, but here are my general impressions on this thing. It tries to be Harman 2018 in its tuning, and it succeeds in some areas. There is almost Harmon level bass shelf, so there's some very good deep bass presence and extension here. Okay, so it rumbles a lot. It's got some good weight and heft to the low end in there. It also has pretty accurate and articulate bass to it with good pitch definition, reasonably good texturing, and like detail retrieval down low and all of that too. Where things start to get a little bit interesting and where it starts to deviate is like through the mids. In looking at the measurements and then also borne out by my ears here, because again, I listened first, then I'm like, there's some unevenness in the mid-range. Where exactly is it? Then I went and looked at the measurement charts. And it's like, oh yeah, around 500 or so hertz, there's a fair dip below the Harman target. Around between 2 and 2.5 kilohertz, there is a fairly significant peak. That's a few dB above the Harman target. Then things get a little bit more erratic once you get up above 10 kilohertz. It does seem to have a little bit of spiciness to it way up in the top end in the air frequencies, but the measurements up there have always been a little bit shaky on there. So by ear, there is just a little bit of spiciness to it, but not anything that's really offensive to me. But what I did notice is that like cymbals and, more like treble instruments like that, they had a thinness to them. Not really a harshness, but they just lacked a little bit of weight and a little bit of body so they sounded like short of realistic to me. Okay, so that's like kind of issue number one. The treble to me is less well tonally balanced than any of the other Dan Clarks I have reviewed. And now I realize that this is one of the cheaper Dan Clarks that I have reviewed. But like to me, the treble smoothness and weight to the tone is no better than the Aeon 2, which is also a relative weakness of the Aeon 2 as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit too. And then also that just the peaks and dips through the mid-range ended up like just vocals also sound thin. They sound lean. They lack tonal weight. And this headphone can be very shouty and very honky with a very hollow timbre a lot. That trait, in fairness, I should say, and I've said this multiple times on my channel, I am a listener who is very sensitive to shout, honk, hollow timbre kinds of stuff. I'm very intolerant of those things. I just don't like them. And the reason that I don't like them is because they don't sound real. Things should only sound like someone is shouting when someone is shouting, right? So if someone sounds like they're shouting and they're just singing, something is wrong. And that to me happened a lot on this headphone, and to the level where it often got very fatiguing very quickly, and I just didn't want to listen to it anymore. Okay. Now, the level to which it sounded shouty and honky is the thing that changed the most from amp to amp. Okay. And so not all is lost there, but let's finish with just the general sound impressions, then we'll talk more about that. Okay, so the tuning is just, it not only does it deviate from Harman, which is, again, kind of Dan's ethos, by a higher amount than any Dan Clark that I have experienced so far through the mid-range, including the Aeon 2. Okay, the mid-range tuning is more erratic and farther away from the Harman target than even this one is to my ear, which is odd since this one is supposed to be the successor. Okay, but it doesn't work for my ears, right? Shouty, honky, hollow to the point of fatiguing and not enjoyable, not realistic. All right, now that said, if that doesn't bother you, there still is a fair amount of detail retrieval here. Like, I don't really have any issues with the amount of detail retrieval or the overall resolution, okay? The texturing is still there. The spatial presentation, even though, like, the mid-range is just kind of erratic there, which often, like, kind of collapses the soundstage a little bit, this one did a good job of maintaining its soundstage width and its depth and a little bit of height to it, so it was still reasonably three-dimensional with decent imaging and separation and layering and all that kind of stuff. So the technical aspects of the sound are pretty good. It's just the tuning is a little off there. All right. Now, the dynamics and the impact are not bad. Dan's headphones have never been overly punchy, slammy, dynamic, impactful, and that sort of thing there. I think that is in part the trade-off he's chosen to make by using the AMTS tuning system or the various passive filters and all that he used with the Aeon and so forth. Just because it's a physics thing. The more matter, the more mass you put between driver and ear, the more you're going to blunt the leading edge of a wavefront, and the harder and harder it is going to be to get impactful dynamics, particularly on the attack. Now, this has more activity to it and liveliness to it than the Stealth does, because that one was the most dynamically dead of his lineup to my ears. But it's not quite to the level of the E3. Okay, so if you're a person who likes a lot of hard-hitting dynamics and all of that, then as with a lot of Dan Clark's, this one is not for you, but it's like not quite up to the level of the, of course, significantly more expensive, okay, E3 there. All right, so, I mean, that's the story on a lot of the technicals and all that. Let's talk about that, the amplifier pairings that I mentioned here a little bit too. Where this headphone was on its best behavior was off of the shit amps. Okay, and so that's not connected to price. And specifically, it was on the halo outputs of the Midgard and the Asgard X. Okay, so the halo output on those amplifiers there is a way of doing amplifier feedback, but it's doing feedback across the headphone itself. This headphone tonally responded really well to that approach. The shoutiness and the honkiness that I described earlier was reduced. Didn't disappear, but it was reduced and allowed me to enjoy this headphone for longer without getting fatigued and be less distracted by the shoutiness, the honkiness of the timbre, that sort of thing in there. Now, both of those amps that I just named that have the halo on it, the Midgard and the Asgard X there, they have a non-halo output. If I used the non-halo output, then yeah, all the shoutiness, the honkiness, and all that came right back in a big way that was like, just please get this off my head, right? So it really benefited without EQ from those halo outputs on those two shit amps. So some of you are going to be not as bothered by the mid-range presentation on this headphone as I am to begin with. And then you're going to run it off of the halo output of one of those shit amps and you're going to be happy and great. Okay, then you are one of the candidates for this headphone. All right. The Valhalla 3 was not too bad. Okay, on there, it does not have the halo output, and I did need to turn on the impedance multiplier on that again. But again, shouty, honky, more than the others with the halo on there and all that. Now, the next best amplifier after the shits was the Z10E. Okay, it just seemed to have the most control to the sound, but it was still shouty, honky, hollow through the mids, thin and kind of brittle sounding in the treble, etc. So that one too got fatiguing to me, although again, it was just not quite as bad as the amps to follow, and that would be the Vielectric HPA V281, which the mids were just really far forward on that. Very shouty, very honky. I just could not listen to it on that amp much at all. Ditto a flat output, meaning non-equalized output from the Luxon X9. Okay, without equalization from that DAC amp there, same story as with the Vio HPA V281. Very shouty, very honky, very hollow, very harsh and brittle treble on there. Just not an enjoyable listening experience for me at all. However, the way the Luxon X9 works is that it has a bank of equalization curves, or frequency response targets, I should say, that it has access to. So I selected this headphone and the Harman 2018 target on that just as a proof of concept to see how it would do. Okay, plug this in, and that was much better. It really evened out the mid-range presentation, brought the bass up slightly, just a little bit more, which I didn't think was necessary, but it did. Okay, like 2 dB or so, but it was noticeable. Like it just became a very bassy experience that actually bled into the lower mids just a little bit to create a little bit more bloat in there. But the improvement through the mids was vast. Okay. That actually became an overall quite enjoyable listening experience. So the best times that I had listening to this headphone were from the Luxon X9, having engaged the equalization preset for this headphone and the Harman 2018 Target. Now, it didn't quite fix the thinness of the treble for my ears on there. The treble, even with the Luxon X9 and that Harman 2018 filter, still a little bit thin, not quite as brittle sounding, but it just still lacked the weight. Like cymbal hits just sounded a little bit thinner and less fleshed out to me than they normally do from the other Dan Clarks that I've mentioned and just most of the headphones that I'm used to using, okay, more often than not. Now, I could have tweaked that even farther and perhaps gotten that dialed in because the Luxon does allow you to make adjustments to those presets, which is good because we all hear a little bit differently. All that, I just didn't take the time to do that, but as a proof of concept, it was a much better experience. So, this headphone does take to equalization well. So, if you are an EQ person, you have a fairly decent starting point here to start playing with EQ, and it will respond fairly well there. All right. Now, what does that mean for where this headphone fits in the market here? Like, without EQ, I prefer the Aeon 2, honestly. Even though the Noire X Open is more resolving, has better detail retrieval, is more three-dimensional and holographic in its spatial presentation than the Aeon 2 is. Without EQ, I just can't do the mid-range on this one. And the mid-range is just better behaved for my ears from the Aeon 2. The treble presentation on each is about the same, has some of the same sonic characteristics to it, which, okay, but it would have been nice to actually have heard some improvement since this one is the successor to this one and so forth. And in the treble presentation, just really isn't there to my ears. Now, I was running this one without filters too, just letting it go in its kind of stock, without filters tuning to see how that would go. All right, I got down the Hi-Fi Man Aria Unveiled here, which I did a review for recently. This is $1,450 US, so it's only $150 more than this one. It is more resolving, more detailed, and like more holographic, just overall more technically proficient than the Dan Clark is. It also has the more natural tuning, particularly with like classical music and that sort of thing. With equalization, I may have preferred slightly the Dan Clark here, the Noire XO, for things like rock, pop, hip hop, metal, that sort of thing, because those kinds of genres are not really in the wheelhouse of the Aria Unveiled, which I talked about in its review. But for like classical and other acoustic genres, this was clearly ahead of the Noire XO, even with the EQ on for the Noire XO. Okay, but without EQ, instrument sounds like violins and all of that. So it's not just vocals, but violins and pianos and brass. They get very thin, unnatural, and I would flinch at times when notes would come on just because they were too far forward and aggressive for me, okay, at my normal listening levels. All right, the E3 here to me is still the sweet spot in Dan's lineup. It is where the balance between performance and price really comes together, and the fact that it does it as a closeback is a huge deal. This one, I would choose to listen to the E3 over the Noire XO, whether the XO was EQ'd or not, all day long. To me, it is just easily the superior headphone. It is like $700 more than the Noire XO, but that $700, to me, is more than worth it here. So again, this is still my favorite Dan Clark, easily so. In there. So again, like, where does the Noire XO fit in the market? It really is going to depend on whether or not its tuning works for you or whether or not you are an EQ person. It's hard for me to recommend, but if you are not as susceptible to the unevenness of tuning that the mid-range on this one has as I am, if that doesn't bother you as much to start and you're willing to use EQ, this can be a pretty good and compelling listening experience across a wide range of musical genres, and that isn't all of that hard to drive. But without equalization, it's no good to me. Okay. It may be for you. It just isn't to me. All right. And that, unfortunately, is where I have to leave it. So I am Wave Theory. Thanks for watching my review of the Dan Clark Audio Noire XO. And please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. I have recently launched channel memberships, so you can check those out, as well as my PayPal and my Patreon. So please generally do those things you do to support YouTube channels. And as always, enjoy the music.